The white wooden house standing in a quiet residential neighborhood near Boston had the warm atmosphere typical of a middle-class family home. In the well-maintained garden with its manicured lawn, the roses that Eleanor Collins had planted were blooming their last flowers of the season in the autumn sunlight. Richard was reading the newspaper with his coffee in hand on a weekend morning, as he always did. "Margaret and the others are coming today, aren't they?" Eleanor called from the kitchen. She had carefully arranged her graying hair and was baking a homemade apple pie in preparation for her daughter's visit. After 35 years of marriage, family meant everything to her. Especially since losing her eldest daughter Elizabeth to illness 3 years ago, her love for her remaining daughter Margaret had grown even deeper. "Yes, I'm looking forward to it," Richard replied, folding his newspaper. "Daniel will be with her too. That young man is truly wonderful. Almost too good for Margaret." Eleanor smiled. Daniel Morrison, her daughter's husband, was a doctor working at the local children's hospital. From the moment they first met him at the wedding a year ago, the couple had been touched by his sincerity and kindness. Most importantly, both parents were deeply grateful that he had brought smiles back to Margaret's face after she had been consumed by grief over Elizabeth's death. Margaret worked as a librarian at the city's public library. Having studied literature in college, she found deep satisfaction in working in the quiet environment surrounded by books. Her sister's death 3 years ago had been a devastating blow, but meeting Daniel had brought new light into her life. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they heard the sound of a car, and Eleanor hurried to the front door. Seeing Margaret and Daniel walking hand in hand, her face lit up with joy. "Welcome home," Eleanor embraced her daughter. Margaret's face had a healthy glow and a happy radiance. "Hello, Mrs. Eleanor," Daniel greeted her politely. His gentle voice and kind eyes always brought peace to the Collins household. "Hello, Dad," Daniel shook hands with Richard. "You look well, which is wonderful." In the living room, the four of them gathered around the apple pie, sharing updates about their lives. Margaret talked about a new project at the library, and Daniel shared stories about the children at the hospital. Richard spoke about recent events at the bank, and Eleanor chatted about neighborhood friends. It was an ordinary but warm family time. "Elizabeth would be happy too," Eleanor murmured suddenly. A moment of silence fell over the room, but it wasn't one of sadness, it was a quiet reverence for their beloved family member. "I'm sure she would be," Margaret answered gently. "My sister is always watching over us." Daniel quietly took Margaret's hand. His eyes held deep understanding and love. Even when Elizabeth's name came up, he never seemed uncomfortable. Rather, he joined the conversation with a naturalness as if he had known her for years. As evening approached, it was time for Margaret and Daniel to go home. At the front door, as they were saying goodbye, Eleanor looked intently at her daughter's face. "Margaret, you've become so beautiful lately. Married life suits you well." Margaret blushed and smiled. "Thank you, Mom. I'm very happy." Eleanor and Richard waved until the car disappeared from sight, then quietly returned to the house. Both felt deeply relieved seeing how happy the young couple looked. The sadness of losing Elizabeth would never disappear, but Margaret's new life brought them the greatest comfort. As autumn deepened, subtle changes began to appear in Margaret's health. One morning at the library, when she tried to drink her usual coffee, she suddenly felt nauseous and rushed to the bathroom. Her colleague Sarah asked if she was okay, with concern, but Margaret herself didn't understand the reason. A few nights later, when Daniel came home from the hospital, Margaret was lying on the sofa. It was usually the time when she would be preparing dinner. "What's wrong? Are you feeling sick?" Daniel, with his medical instincts, immediately noticed the change in his wife's condition. He placed his hand on her forehead and checked her pulse. "I'm just a little tired," Margaret tried to smile, but her complexion was clearly poor. "I've been feeling sick since morning." Daniel's expression changed. From his medical experience, a certain possibility occurred to him. "Margaret, when was your last period?" Margaret thought about it. In her busy daily life, she hadn't been conscious of such things. Come to think of it, it might have been almost 3 weeks since my last one. Let's do a test. Daniel's voice was gentle, but he could feel his heart beating faster. The next morning, the two of them bought a pregnancy test at the nearby drugstore. After returning home, while Margaret was in the bathroom, Daniel waited in the living room. His palms were sweaty. Although they hadn't talked specifically about children very much, deep in his heart he had been dreaming of starting a family. Daniel. Margaret's trembling voice came from the bathroom. Daniel hurried over. Margaret was standing there holding the pregnancy test, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm pregnant, Margaret whispered. Daniel was speechless for a moment, then gently embraced Margaret. Really? Is it really true? They cried while holding each other. It was a complex mix of joy, surprise, and a little anxiety. We have to tell Mom and Dad, Margaret said, wiping away her tears. Yes. But let's make sure first before we announce it. Next week, I'll have you take a detailed examination at my hospital. Daniel was cautious as a doctor. A week later, the hospital test results confirmed the pregnancy. She was diagnosed as 7 weeks pregnant, and the due date was set for early summer the following year. Margaret gazed at the ultrasound image, feeling the reality of the small life within her. Let's announce it at our anniversary party, Daniel suggested. It's next month, and both our parents and relatives will be there, so it's perfect timing. Margaret agreed. The two remembered their wedding a year ago. The wedding without Elizabeth had been lonely, but blessed by Daniel's warm family and the Collins relatives, it had been a wonderful day. This time it would be a celebration of new life. Preparations began in earnest. Margaret got help from her library colleagues to design the invitations. Daniel also reached out to his hospital colleagues, and they ended up inviting about 50 close friends and family. They booked a party room at a small hotel in the city. Eleanor said, handmade warmth is what matters most, and helped prepare the decorations. Richard also said, my daughter's happiness is the most important thing, and generously supported the expenses. What dress should I wear? Margaret was wondering as she walked through the shopping mall with Eleanor. She was still in early pregnancy and her belly wasn't showing yet, but they needed to consider the changes in her body. How about this white dress? Eleanor picked up a simple and elegant A-line dress. It reminds me of your wedding dress from a year ago. Margaret tried on the dress in the fitting room. Looking at herself in the mirror, she noticed something different. A maternal softness was beginning to appear in her face. She gently placed her hand on her still flat belly, feeling the reality of the new life growing there. You look lovely, Margaret. Eleanor looked at her daughter with an expression of emotion. You're so beautiful. 2 weeks before the party, Margaret and Daniel invited both sets of parents for dinner. They were still keeping the pregnancy secret, but their desire to share something was growing. How are the party preparations going? Richard asked. They're going smoothly, Daniel answered. We have a special announcement to make that day. A special announcement? Eleanor's eyes sparkled. What kind? That's a surprise for the day, Margaret smiled meaningfully. Eleanor seemed to sense something immediately. With a woman's intuition, she had picked up on the changes in her daughter's expression and atmosphere. But she wasn't certain. Could it be? Eleanor started to say and stopped. No, it's nothing. I'm sure it will be a wonderful announcement. That night, Eleanor said to Richard, Margaret might be pregnant. Is that so? Richard's face lit up. That would be wonderful news. But we're not certain, so let's wait until the party. The day before the party, Margaret was feeling anxious. What will everyone think? We've only been married for a year. It'll be fine, Daniel embraced his wife. Everyone will surely be happy for us. You're going to be a wonderful mother next year. I want to tell Elizabeth too, Margaret murmured, looking at her sister's photograph. I'm sure she's happy too, Daniel's voice held deep gentleness. Elizabeth is always watching over you. On the morning of the party, Margaret put on her white dress and stood in front of the mirror. Her belly was still flat, but she smiled as she gently placed her hand on it. Today, she would tell the family about the new life. Everyone would surely be happy. On the autumn evening, the hotel party room was bathed in warm golden light. About 50 close friends and family had gathered to celebrate Margaret and Daniel's first wedding anniversary. Wedding photos of the couple decorated the walls, and autumn flowers were tastefully arranged on the tables. The decorations Eleanor had chosen created exactly the warm atmosphere filled with family love. Margaret wore her white A-line dress and greeted guests at the entrance to the venue. Her 3-month pregnant belly was still barely noticeable, but she occasionally placed her hand on it gently and smiled. Daniel stood beside her in a black tuxedo, shaking hands with arriving guests. "Margaret, you look so beautiful," her library colleague Sarah said. "You seem to be glowing somehow." "Thank you," Margaret answered with flushed cheeks. Thinking about tonight's announcement made her heart race. Richard and Eleanor were chatting with their son's family, relatives, and longtime friends. Every time Eleanor looked at her daughter, her maternal instincts kicked in. Margaret's expression had a special radiance different from their wedding a year ago. "It's time for the toast," Daniel said quietly to Margaret. His palms were slightly damp with nervousness. "Yes, I'm ready," Margaret took a deep breath. At 8 o'clock, Daniel picked up a glass and tapped it lightly to get the attention of the room. Conversations gradually quieted, and all eyes turned to the newlyweds. "Everyone, thank you so much for taking your valuable time to be here with us tonight," Daniel began in a calm voice. "Marrying this wonderful woman a year ago was the greatest happiness of my life." Warm applause arose from the venue. Margaret looked at her husband and smiled with loving affection. "And tonight, we would like to share another special piece of news with all of you." Daniel gave Margaret a meaningful look. Margaret stepped forward. The hem of her white dress swayed gracefully, and the venue's lighting made her hair shine like gold. "Everyone," Margaret's voice trembled slightly with emotion. "A new family member will be joining us." She gently placed her hand on her belly. "We're expecting a baby." The venue was enveloped in silence for a moment, then filled with joyful voices and applause. Friends stood up and offered congratulations one after another. However, Richard and Eleanor's expressions were complicated. They tried to show joy, but something was bothering them. Eleanor stood up. "Margaret, I need to talk to you." Margaret was puzzled by her mother's stern expression. "Here and now?" "Yes, right now," Eleanor's voice echoed through the venue. As people around them turned to look, she walked up to her daughter. "Announcing your pregnancy like this," Eleanor's voice trembled with anger. "Why didn't you consult us first?" Margaret was confused. "Mom, we're married. There's no need to consult." Getting married after becoming pregnant would be one thing, but announcing pregnancy after marriage, Eleanor's voice grew even louder. "How shameless." The venue buzzed with confusion. The guests couldn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, Eleanor's hand struck Margaret's cheek. The sharp sound echoed throughout the venue. "Mom." Margaret held her cheek, tears welling up. Richard also stood up. "Disgraceful," he said spitefully. "I can't believe my daughter would do such a thing." The venue fell completely silent. Close friends stood there unable to understand what was happening. Margaret looked at her husband with pleading eyes. At that moment, Daniel quietly stood up. His face was different from his usual gentle expression, it was filled with dignity. "Father-in-law, mother-in-law," Daniel's voice echoed through the venue. "Don't you know the true value of this baby?" Richard and Eleanor looked at Daniel with confused expressions. "Value? What are you talking about?" Richard asked. Daniel took Margaret's hand. "Actually, this child is." He paused for a moment and looked around the venue. All eyes were on him. This child is Elizabeth's child. A silence like thunder falling struck the venue. The color drained from Richard and Eleanor's faces. What are you saying? Eleanor asked in a trembling voice. Elizabeth died 3 years ago. Richard was also confused. Daniel took a deep breath. Elizabeth had her fertilized eggs frozen before receiving chemotherapy. And in her will, she expressed her wish to entrust those fertilized eggs to Margaret. Margaret looked at her husband through her tears. The moment had come when the truth they had kept secret would finally be revealed. That's impossible, Eleanor almost collapsed into a chair. We don't know anything about that. Please check with the hospital, Daniel answered calmly. Elizabeth's will is also on file. She was thinking of this family until the very end. Richard stood up with his face bright red. Is such a thing even possible? It's medically possible, Daniel answered as a doctor. We performed the implantation surgery 3 months ago. Margaret is now carrying Elizabeth's child. The venue guests gasped. Everyone stared at this extraordinary situation with expressions of disbelief. Eleanor sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands. Elizabeth. Why didn't you tell us? Margaret shouted at her parents. My sister wanted to entrust her child to me. We didn't know, Richard answered weakly. We heard nothing from the hospital. Because you had requested the immediate destruction of the fertilized eggs, Daniel's words echoed through the venue. But the hospital respected Elizabeth's will. With these words, both parents were completely shaken. After their daughter's death, they had wanted to forget everything. They had refused all contact from the hospital. Eleanor's voice became tearful. We just wanted to let Elizabeth rest in peace. But Elizabeth's true wish was different. Margaret stood up. My sister wanted to live. And she wanted to leave behind someone she loved. As heavy silence filled the venue, Daniel took a deep breath before continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for shocking you all. But we needed to tell you this truth. Richard gripped the back of his chair with trembling hands. Daniel, what exactly are you saying? Elizabeth 3 years ago. Yes, Elizabeth died of ovarian cancer at the young age of 26. Daniel's voice was quiet but filled with conviction. However, before receiving chemotherapy, she had entrusted her hopes for the future. Eleanor looked up and stared at Daniel with tear-filled eyes. What do you mean? We heard nothing about this. Daniel took an envelope from his jacket's inner pocket. This is a copy of the will Elizabeth left at the hospital. I was keeping it as her attending physician. Attending physician? Margaret looked at her husband in surprise. You were Elizabeth's. Yes, Daniel nodded quietly. I'm a pediatrician, but at that time I was doing my residency in oncology. I was one of Elizabeth's attending physicians. The venue guests gasped. Everyone was speechless at this incredible coincidence, or rather, this fateful connection. So you approached me because... Margaret's voice was shaking. At first, yes, Daniel answered honestly. I approached you to fulfill Elizabeth's final wish. But Margaret, please believe me. My love for you now is real. As I got to know you, I came to love you from the bottom of my heart. Richard clenched his fists in anger. So you planned this from the beginning? You deceived my daughter and married her? Father-in-law, please listen. Daniel took an old letter from the envelope. This is the will Elizabeth wrote. He unfolded the letter and began reading the words written in Elizabeth's beautiful handwriting. To Dad, Mom, and my beloved Margaret. If I am leaving this letter, it means my time is limited. But please don't despair. I am leaving behind hope. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand, and tears wouldn't stop flowing. It was as if she could hear her daughter's voice. Daniel continued, I froze my fertilized eggs before receiving chemotherapy. Someday, even if I never have the chance to bear children, my love will remain. Margaret, I believe you will lovingly raise my child. You are the kindest and strongest woman I know. Margaret stood up with tears streaming down her face. My sister wanted to entrust that to me? Of course, this is not forced, Daniel continued, looking at the letter. Only when Margaret has a happy marriage and truly wants children from her heart should she know this option exists. My beloved sister, your happiness is my greatest wish. Richard collapsed into his chair. Why didn't you tell us? We tried to tell you, a hint of anger crept into Daniel's voice. After Elizabeth passed away, the hospital tried to contact you both. But you said you wanted to forget everything about your daughter and demanded the immediate destruction of the fertilized eggs. Eleanor covered her face. That's right, at that time I couldn't bear it. But the hospital has an obligation to respect the patient's will, Daniel continued. Since Elizabeth had a clear intention, we continued to preserve the fertilized eggs. So you approached Margaret because of that? Richard asked weakly. At first it was because of my promise to Elizabeth, Daniel answered honestly. But when I met Margaret and learned of her kindness and strength, I truly fell in love. This wasn't calculation. It was destiny. Margaret looked at her husband. Was our marriage false? No, Daniel shook his head firmly. Margaret, I love you from the bottom of my heart. Even if my promise to Elizabeth was the initial trigger, our love now is real. And this child, he gently indicated Margaret's belly, this child will be born from love. The people in the venue were captivated by this complex and beautiful love story. Sarah, the library colleague, wiped away tears and murmured, "What a beautiful story." Eleanor stood up and walked unsteadily toward Margaret. Margaret. What have I done? Mom, Margaret embraced her mother. You were just grieving. You were so consumed by the sadness of losing my sister that you couldn't think of anything else. But I trampled on Elizabeth's final wish, Eleanor cried on her daughter's shoulder. And I slapped you. That's all in the past now, Margaret rubbed her mother's back. What matters is that now, my sister's love lives on within us. Richard also approached his daughters with heavy steps. Daniel, do you truly love Margaret? Yes, Daniel answered without hesitation. She is my very life. And this child in her womb is a miracle where Elizabeth's love, Margaret's love, and my love have united. Elizabeth. Richard looked up to the heavens. You were thinking of your family until the very end. Daniel picked up the letter again. Elizabeth also wrote this, Dad, Mom, please don't grieve my death. My love will live forever in this family in a different form. When Margaret becomes a mother, I will become a mother with her. Silence returned to the venue. However, it was different from the shocking silence before, it was a silence filled with deep emotion. Eleanor took the letter and traced her daughter's handwriting with her finger. Elizabeth, I'm sorry. I didn't understand your feelings. But it's not too late even now, Margaret took her mother's hand. Let's carry on my sister's love and raise this child with care. Richard stood before Daniel. I must apologize to you. I doubted you and hurt my daughter. Father-in-law, it's all right, Daniel extended his hand. We're going to become a real family from now on. The two men shook hands firmly. Natural applause arose from the people in the venue. It was applause much deeper and more heartfelt than the initial congratulatory applause. Margaret placed her hand on her belly and looked around the venue. Everyone, I'm sorry for sharing our family's complicated circumstances with you. But this is our truth. Love sometimes appears in the most unexpected forms. A library colleague stood up. Margaret, this is a beautiful love story. How wonderful that Elizabeth's love is still alive. Daniel's hospital colleague also nodded. It's a miracle made possible by medical advances. But what made it reality was pure love. Eleanor placed her hand on Margaret's belly. Elizabeth's child, my grandchild. And the new hope of our family. 6 months later in spring, the voice of new life echoed through the maternity hospital near Boston. In Margaret and Daniel's arms, a little girl cried her first cry. She was healthy and beautiful, bearing Elizabeth's likeness. Elizabeth Jr., Margaret called her daughter's name through tears. Your aunt's name. In the waiting room, Richard and Eleanor were trembling with excitement. Since that night, the two had changed. They had read Elizabeth's will many times and came to understand their daughter's deep love. Our first grandchild, Eleanor said in a tearful voice. The crystallization of Elizabeth's, Margaret's, and Daniel's love. When Daniel appeared in the waiting room holding the baby, Richard stood up. She's truly a beautiful child. She looks just like Elizabeth. Daniel handed the baby to the grandparents. The moment Eleanor held her first grandchild, tears overflowed from her eyes. Elizabeth, you've come back to us. In the weeks that followed, the Collins house was filled with the vitality of new life. Richard came home early from work to help care for his granddaughter, and Eleanor visited Margaret's house almost daily. Every time I think about that night, I feel so sorry, Eleanor said to her daughter one day. I slapped you and tried to deny this child's existence. Mom, forget about that now, Margaret took her mother's hand. What matters is that we're all here together now. Daniel balanced his work as a pediatrician with fatherhood, caring for Elizabeth Jr. every night. Every time she cried, he would whisper, Aunt Elizabeth is watching over you. One evening, when the family of 4 was gathered in the living room, Richard spoke up. Daniel, I want to apologize to you about something. Father-in-law, that's enough, Daniel replied. No, let me say it, Richard's eyes were serious. You've fulfilled Elizabeth's final wish. And you've made Margaret truly happy. You are the son we had been looking for. When Elizabeth Jr. celebrated her first birthday, the family held a small party. This time it was peaceful and filled with love. This child was born with the love of 3 people, Eleanor said, holding her granddaughter. Elizabeth's love, Margaret's love, and Daniel's love. Margaret looked at her husband and daughter and thought about how a year ago, that night when everything came to light, she had felt like the world was ending. But now she realized it had been a new beginning. We learned what a real family is, Margaret said to Daniel. It's not just blood relations, Daniel replied. Love, trust, and the feeling of supporting each other, that's what creates a family. When Elizabeth Jr. first said, Mama, Margaret looked up to the sky. Can you hear that, Elizabeth? Your daughter has started talking. Richard and Eleanor began telling their friends about this miraculous family story. At first people didn't believe them, but Elizabeth Jr.'s existence was proof above all else. It's a miracle of modern medicine, friends would say. No, Eleanor would answer. This is a miracle of love. Science gave us the possibility, but it was love that made it reality. Daniel sometimes thought about Elizabeth at the hospital. He remembered the last words she said, tell my sister about my love. Now, that promise had been fulfilled. Elizabeth's love had returned to this world in a different form. Margaret sang the same lullaby every night as she put her daughter to sleep. It was the song Elizabeth used to sing to her when they were young. Love continues forever, Margaret whispered to her daughter. Your aunt's love, mommy's love, and daddy's love too. In the Collins family living room, 3 photographs are displayed, Elizabeth's photograph, Margaret and Daniel's wedding photo, and Elizabeth Jr.'s photograph. 3 generations of love weave together one story. They learned that a real family is one that continues to be connected by love even beyond death. And that love is inherited forever in new life.